everyone, and welcome to the Truth and Data podcast, where each episode we tackle a different digital forensics topic. I'm Jessica,
I'm Debbie.
and this week we're going to talk about the truth in data location evidence. I am so excited because with us we have two premier experts in digital location evidence and how it can be presented in court, Phil Thrasher and Alec Hurst from Lumix. Thanks for
How's it
joining.
going, y'all?
It's good to see you
Yeah,
guys.
thanks for having us. Good to see y'all too.
Now, full disclaimer, Hexordia and Lumix have a relationship. We're a reseller for Lumix, but that's only because we really believe in what they're doing. And we're not going to be talking about the product here. If you want that, contact us for a demo. Here today, we're going to be talking about geolocation evidence. And we'll start with what I think is the crux of this conversation, which is the relationship between space and time. And I really, I'm a big sci-fi junkie. Actually, right now, and this will probably date this episode, I'm reading Project Hail Mary, which, if nobody's read it, this is both a saga that takes place in space and jumps back and forth in time. So it feels really, really appropriate. And if you haven't read this book, read this book. But my book reviews are not part of our podcast. But one of the challenges when we typically look at location data is we look at location data from multiple points in time on a flat map, and we don't typically add that space element, right? Taking the two-dimensional map and plotting locations on it, and then sometimes putting arrows and talking about it. What are your thoughts on how examiners in their day-to-day explanations of the digital data they're looking at can explain that time that location data doesn't just exist an in a vacuum? It has this time element that pertains to it.
Yeah, I think the way I think about it with location data, it's like if you're looking at it statically on a map, you're losing so much context compared to if you just incorporate a timestamp. When we're talking about location data, there's a lot of other elements like speed, direction, and really all of these things can be encapsulated if you just have time included in that location data, right? Like if you can press play on that location data, each location with its timestamp is being played back. You can determine which direction they were going, how long they dwelled at one particular location, all the things that you might need to understand or know about location data with the context, just having timestamps.
That tells a more full picture, a more accurate story when you combine the two.
It really reminds me of, like, if you look at a physics problem and you're reading the problem and you're looking at the formula, it can seem very overbearing. But then if you do a practical exercise and you watch two balls accelerate, you can actually see the problem and it makes sense to people. It's like such a better teaching aid. So, and I feel like a lot of times when we're explaining our evidence, we are teachers. We're teaching the judge, or we're teaching the jury, or we're teaching the executives about what this data means. And so, yeah, it might make sense to us in our heads. And I think that's part of the problem. Is I think I can look at a list of Latin longs with time and know the circumstance of the evidence, and it's making sense in my brain.
Mm-hmm.
But it doesn't demonstrate well, and it doesn't explain it well.
A great example of this is, if you just look at all data points that have time associated with them on a map, it'll be a blob of data, right? You don't know where they started, where they went first, etc.
You might see a concentration, right? You might see a
Right.
concentration,
Yes.
like, oh, and what we
Yeah.
usually do is this might be the person's home or this might be the person's work based on the clusters.
Right.
But if we could see when they were doing it, we could tell which one was more likely home and which one was more likely work.
That's right.
Yeah.
Exactly.
I really like that. So I'm gonna pivot. I'm a mobile forensics girly, so I'm gonna pivot to mobile data. And one of the challenges as a mobile examiner, and I brief attorneys all the time, and this is what happens. I do all my work in UTC. I convert my final report to local, but About personally, when I work in UTC, and that means when I have interim meetings, I'm sitting there and I'm plus fiving, minus fiving, plus sixing, minus sevening. Things are changing time zones, but I have everything in UTC, and I'm showing location data that has location, which means, mobile devices move from time zone to time zone. People take them on planes, people take them in cars. What do you think? What are your suggestions as to which way data is best to work with and which way is best to display? And how do you deal with the reality of a map when someone crosses a time zone and maybe is coming back and forth, right? Maybe they're going from Pensacola to Tallahassee or something of the like.
Josh probably has a better answer for the time zone.
Yeah, I think there's a few things there to unpack. You've got the presentation questions, which I'll let Alec answer, but you've got just in terms of capturing the time zone when a timestamp occurred is very important. Forensic accuracy there is very important. Crossing time zone boundaries, it really depends on the device. A phone crossing a time zone boundary, every app in that phone doesn't just automatically update the
Right.
time zone it's reporting, right? So it really depends. There's a lot of factors at play there, and you have to understand those factors and know how to parse those artifacts correctly.
And that's a good point, right? Because you've got to remember, while most system artifacts do tend to be UTC on mobile, a lot of app artifacts will use local time, but not necessarily even the local time of the phone. They might be using the local time of the cloud server. I've seen that on some
Right.
apps.
Yep.
So you have to know what the data is, but then make it all match. Blah.
Brutal. Time zones are always brutal times in general.
Yeah.
And then the worst time is like, and we just went through it, and this is a really, really, these wonky ones where we have some states in the US change time zones and Europe changes time zones, but we do it in different weeks.
Different. Yeah.
So, like, where normally there's a 4 hour or a 5 hour offset, you might now suddenly have a 6 hour offset or a 3 hour offset. Like, your offset can be different. In Australia, this goes from like 14 to 16 hours for some parts of Australia, but only for like 2 weeks of the year. And if you have case data in those 2 weeks, it can really, really, really mess with people. And mess with locations and dates. I did an evil thing on a CTF maybe about 7 years ago where I started the morning in New Zealand and later in the day was in Australia. And so I took a 5 hour flight that crossed 3 time zones, and which is actually the same as going from the East Coast to the West Coast. But it was very public that I was in Australia that day. So people like OSINTed me and assumed that this picture was taken in Australia that was taken in New Zealand, because I then posted it in Australia. But had you had the relationship of the time, you know what I'm saying? Like, if you can actually bring in the time element and the location element, it does get confusing though, because sometimes, I'll tell you my preference is I always work in UTC. But when I explain data, I try to explain data to people in their local time. Except for when I worked off foreign data while working domestically, then I would always do it in that region, like pick one place in that region. So let's say my device was moving from Pakistan to Jordan. Okay, these are different time zones. They're off considerably. But even though I'm in the US, I would pick one and give all the times in local Pakistani time or all the times in local Jordanian time. And then
You don't want the viewer to have to do time date math in their head.
Correct.
And sometimes it makes sense, like where the incident happened, this person was doing this act at 10 p.m. their time, and then that you're like, oh, it's nighttime,
Correct. And, even if we're talking now, sometimes what'll happen is I'll wind up putting a second column up. But when I'm displaying something on a map and I'm traversing, and maybe I'm traversing, again, from Tallahassee to Pensacola, which is 2 different time zones in the same state. Let's say, you're doing that drive. What could happen is, as you're presenting that data, if you're not aware, if suddenly, if some of the timestamps are in their local, it would look like you're in two different places at the same time, which actually maybe the visual helps you realize when you've got that error because you're probably not in two different places at the same time. But or you suddenly have an hour jump in space where it looks like somebody disappeared. Um, but I think that's why it's easier sometimes to just work in UTC, and then pick what your presentation model's going to be.
Right. Right. The workflow that we are normally seeing, and kind of like when we thought about, okay, what's the best experience in general? When you initially load the data, you get it in local time, displayed in your, in
But
general.
I can load UTC and get local.
Yeah.
Right.
Exactly.
Yeah.
So by
We
default,
prefer you load UTC. That's preference.
Well, that's what I work in, right? So that's why I, as an analyst, work in. So that makes sense, right? You load
Right.
UTC and then you see in local. So
right.
because who wants? Again, I'm not going to brief a jury in UTC. I might have on a public case left a UTC timestamp in a first paragraph because I write all my reports initially with UTC and then convert.
Totally.
And I totally did it in a very public case and got called out on it. I was like, yeah, it's UTC. Like, that's human error. But anyway, that's the whole world knows I made that mistake. So,
That's what we see. People start local and then they go UTC to do the deep analysis. And then they'll typically assign an explicit time zone to that case.
Right.
When it's going to go to like a courtroom or something like that.
Exactly. And then if you miss one in your report, like I did, and the whole, it's one thing when you do it in something nobody ever sees, but it's another thing when you do it on something that everybody saw. All right. So we've got this forensic best practice now. Look in UTC, present findings in local time. Now I'm gonna move into a completely different realm, which is accuracy. Okay. There's a really, really, really big difference between what we get from assisted GPS, where we're like 1 to 5 meters, versus like Wi-Fi at like 200 meters. What is your suggestion on how to deal with the variance of accuracy pertaining to the precision of a geolocation?
Yeah, I have one answer, Thresh. If you have something that popped up, you can start. But I have a more kind of just subjective.
No, go for it. Yeah, I want to hear yours first.
So, like in general, accuracy. I'm sure, Jessica, you spent so much time thinking about this, and you're probably going to tell me no, that this is a terrible idea. But subjectively,
that's what makes this podcast great. I might. No, I'm joking.
To make things entertaining. To be told I'm wrong.
I'm joking. Come be our guest. Jessica will yell at you. No, that's not what we do here. You know me better than that. I'll say it politely. No, I'm joking. Finish your thought. No.
So like you do get incredibly inaccurate data from like most mobile extractions that, it's just so inaccurate that you just have to.
Well, I'm gonna some data sources. Let's not say for mobile extractions in general. We're not going to say that mobile data in general is inaccurate for geolocation. We could say that there are some specific artifact sources that are wildly inaccurate. Okay.
Exactly. Yeah. Yeah. So besides those like incredibly inaccurate data sources, there's really like a fuzzy, how inaccurate can it be for it to not be useful anymore? I know it was kind of a double negative, but what I'm seeing frequently is like there's a lot of cases where there's very large horizontal radius on certain artifacts, and they're still worth including in that courtroom presentation, particularly if somebody's taking a long, like a cross-country road trip, for example. Even if those accuracies are massive, but it took them, day and a half, 2 days, and the dots go from California to New York. This is a very contrived example, but anytime somebody's traveling a long distance with wide accuracies, there's still, a relatively good case to make for that person having traveled from the West Coast to the East Coast, which may be the important aspect of that data set. So I think it really depends on, what you're trying to show.
I'll agree with you that it depends. I will say that what I've had on the stand is, you're sitting there with your map of your geolocations and you've got your different horizontal accuracy circles demonstrating different artifacts, right? You've got some artifacts that are Wi-Fi based, some that are AGPS based. And when you're looking at those circles, what I've been questioned on the stand, sitting there speaking to those locations, are, well, doesn't that mean that this person could be way out here, which is way outside the area of the crime, and hence you're introducing reasonable doubt?
Right.
While I think this is actually the importance of bringing in the time element, because if you bring in the time element, you can demonstrate, if you have tighter looped artifacts, that it has to be in almost the Venn diagram join of those different circles for any moment in time. So then if you have a moment in time, and I've had this, they're like, well, for this moment in time, you don't have a tight circle. So they could be out here. And I'm like, only if they could teleport. Because 2 minutes later, they're back within 5 meters, if that makes sense. But this is really, really hard if you don't have time, because and I have had, like, over on an overhead projector, the concentric circles put up and been really asked, well, what means that they're not out here? And
can you not also use multiple artifacts to corroborate each other?
Debbie, 100%.
Okay.
Yeah, no, but that's actually the argument that they'll make to me. It's like, let's say we have 3 artifacts, and let's say we have 2 artifacts that are within 5 meters, and they're like a minute apart, and then we have one that's a 200-meter artifact. And let's say the crime took place on this side of the street, but this concentric circle covers this side of the street. And they'll go, no, they were across the street. They could have, is it not true that they couldn't have been across the street? Will be the question, based on this circle. And my response will be, well, that circle doesn't exist as a single artifact, right? To your point, Debbie, right? Like, that circle exists with the existence of these 2 other artifacts. So in order for the person to have gotten there, it is improbable that a human being could get from this smaller, tighter concentric circle, which is inside the bigger concentric circle, to that location and back in the time period between these 2 smaller, tighter concentric circles, right? Because what will happen is the timestamps will be
max
staggered.
travel time. Yeah.
Right.
Right.
It's gotten messy for me on the stand, though, because what they're trying to do to the jury or the judge or the trier of fact is introduce doubt in the artifact. And then the question is, do we even show those? I get Alex's argument for showing the less precise artifacts. And then if you don't show it, then it gets reintroduced from opposing counsel. Well, why didn't you introduce this? Because it's less accurate. But isn't it true that it could be here? Yeah, 100%. So I tend to move on the side of including them as long as they're not erroneous, right? So erroneous artifacts, LTE cell tower locations, things like that are just figments of existence. You probably are demonstrating that you're in the same country. No, I'm joking. More precise than that. Depends on the size of the country, but you know what I mean. I agree. I'm not going to include those artifacts, but I will include Wi-Fi connections, for example, even though they're broader, because it is true that that connection could be within that larger circle, but I have to corroborate it with my other artifacts. And I do
you can also use that. You can also use that to show things that are naturally exclusionary, like a cell tower that's close that they didn't connect to, or Wi-Fi access points that are close that they didn't connect to or didn't see even.
I like that
says,
for
well,
exclusionary. Yeah, that's really a good point about exclusionary artifacts. But I think the point is that, again, without time, it becomes really, really hard to look at those on a flat map and make that connection. Because otherwise the questions will always be, well, then they dance again inside this bigger circle. And yes, if that was the sole artifact, that is true, but it's not, right?
Yeah. One of the things that we, like right when we started building our product, we were, instantly working with a lot of mobile forensic data in particular. And before we kind of like put together any of the ways you can navigate through that data in the UI, we were like, okay, what could we put in here to make it so that you can just understand this location data set off of a mobile device with thousands, tens, hundreds of thousands of points, and just get a feel for what it is. And what we landed on was this like little widget on the bottom, we just call it like a playback slider. It's different than a play and pause button, which I think is still useful. Like being able to press play, set your playback speed, but it's way more useful to have this slider that you can click and drag and quickly navigate through years worth of data and just be like, okay, where do the dots pop up? Where do they disappear? Okay, this part's right here is really interesting around the time of the crime. Like they, took one trip up north and then they came back down. The rest of the time they dwelled in this location. So being able to scrub through that data, and like now that I mentioned this, probably every forensic provider is going to add one of these sliders to their.
A lot of timeline explorers do have that kind of slider, but it's more like histogram based. So like I'm thinking of like the tool ArtX. Shout out to Ian Whiffen. And as you're scrolling the ArtX widget, you see like you'd have all the artifacts you selected, and you see kind of a histogram of how many events each one of them have and so it gives you a good feel of, well, here's where a whole bunch of like application activity is versus a whole bunch of like power cycles or whatever you're looking at.
Same kind of value.
So it's the same kind of value. So if people like that when they can see that in the histogram, seeing it, but you actually see the dots on the map come in and out. I'm gonna turn it to the opposite. You just said when you have a whole bunch of geolocation, and I'll tell you that one of my biggest concerns right now is the volatility of location data. And I'll speak right to the iOS cache being only 7 days, and after that you only get significant locations. And with that iOS cache locations only being 7 days of data, what are your suggestions in that regard when we're dealing with volatile geolocation data?
Yeah, so I think we do see this all the time. As we know in the industry, it's a big problem, like how long it can take to get access to these devices and the quality of the extraction as time tails off. You do frequently, drop an extraction in a visualization tool, and it's just like not a lot of data, not much to go off of. And like you said, the defense is going to do everything they can to introduce doubt. So like, what's the best way to counter that? It's combine other things with.
I was going to say, from an investigative standpoint, I'm going to be looking for everything else that I can find that also has location data to help
witness
corroborate.
testimony, surveillance footage, body
cameras, cars.
Right.
Like looking for other data to add to it.
Right. I would put out any IoT sensors, like anything else in the environment, because those. So here's the interesting thing. We speak about location data, and we think about location data being an artifact that has a lat and a long, and hopefully a timestamp. I would argue that you can have something with a timestamp that has no lat and long if it's a fixed sensor. So a Nest doorbell being a fixed sensor, your surveillance footage being a fixed sensor. Anything that's a fixed sensor, I would love to be able to introduce that with its appropriate lat and long for where this fixed sensor existed, and say
block cameras fit this bill too.
Right. And whatever exists data from this particular sensor in an environment is a fixed location, and therefore I do have time and date location for that fixed sensor.
Right.
Yeah.
And it's just like flipping your head conceptually that, well, maybe you do have fixed data as long as it's not something that is movable. On the flip, I would give the second advocacy personally, which is acquisition is preservation. You knew I was going to say it because it's almost like my tagline at this point. But, one of the reasons that we don't get that rich iOS location cache data is because we are waiting on the ability, even though the device has been seized, to be able to image it. And I'm still going to stick to my point that my friends in the legal field, you should, for both inculpatory and exculpatory evidence, you should be excuse me, arguing for doing that acquisition to preserve that data, because geolocation data, I think, is like the biggest example of why you need to preserve now. People are like, oh, we can defeat the AFU BFU relock. We can, which is a cat and game mouse. We all know that. Oh, we can get into devices even if, even if the data port has turned into a charging port. All of these other nuanced technical, like cat and mouse games, we can't make the geolocation data come back, and we can't, that's the number one thing, right?
Mhm.
Acquisitions preservation. Let's just get that data now. Don't look at it, right? I don't know. Sorry. Um, Horse
Oh, I
dead.
totally agree.
I just feel like I need that. All right. How do you deal with, or what are your suggestions for dealing with artifacts? Speaking about, again, if we don't get that location data, what do we get on iOS from a location perspective? If we don't get cache locations, we get significant locations. And I've actually done quite a few Dauberts on significant locations in the last year. And I'm not going to get into the ins and outs of those, but significant locations have they have a vicinity entry and a vicinity exit time. So these have a geolocation and they have a time, but it's an entry time and an exit time. How would you deal with something like demonstrating the value of something with an entry and an exit time, noting that an entry time means that they were entered someplace before that time, and an exit time meaning that they exited at that, right? Like they entered it at that time or before, not later than, and an exit time meaning they exited at that time or before, not later than.
Yeah, I mean, you can show the range, right? We can show range points. We support that, and then significant locations have a radius because it's a place, not a point, right? But
Right, it's a place, not a point. And
right,
so you have, the thing is you have a range on both the time and the
hmm
place.
that's right. You have a range on both, and yeah, I think it's important. Really, I mean, fundamentally, any tool, any tool that intends to help justice that wants to show this data has to capture all of that data and has to have a way of showing that data visually. Um, And I mean, I don't. You could probably drive past one of your significant locations instead of the stoplight if you're right out at the front of a storefront. And Apple, if you're there long enough, might think, "Oh, hold on, that was they maybe are here. They stopped in for a minute." It's important to really be able to show visually, like, this is where they could have been, and this is the times, and that's it. That's all we have.
Right.
Because any interpretation beyond that is guesswork.
I would say the other cool thing about significant locations is they've been to that location before at least once.
Right. That's right.
And
Yeah.
and this is, I mention this because that has been significant in cases, because the argument of, well, they could have been there by accident. Well, they've been there at least before once, right? And the first
Mhm.
time is never in the data, right? It's you get
Mm-hmm.
the tertiary, the secondary and tertiary times, and you
Right.
don't necessarily, being someplace twice doesn't necessarily make it a significant location. Oh, significant
Right.
locations are one of my fun favorites. All right, I'm going to bring up an interesting topic because I've seen this argument met, and uh, I feel like this is like an iOS geolocation talk, but in iOS, we've got these different classes of uh, access to information. So we just talked about geolocations from the cache locations and from significant locations, and both of those are core native Apple functionality. So they have what's called Class A access. They have access to the most precise. And a third party application like your driving app will also have, so Google Maps, even though it's not an Apple, see, I had to purposely pick Google Maps because I'm talking about Apple, so I could show third party, would still have the precision access to be able to give you accurate driving locations. However, other apps, like let's say a weather app, which needs to know your general location but not your precise location, get either a Class B or a Class C access to the geolocation. So it's obfuscated a few steps by Apple for delivery to that app for protection of privacy. What are your thoughts on sharing third party app geolocation data that could be stored in terms of its reliability and being a little bit different with regards to precision, though the native artifact would still, like, for any moment that there is a precision artifact, right? I mean, that there's a less precise artifact. The device still knows where it is, right? So the precision artifact exists in that time. However, if you're past your 7 days, you've lost it, right? So if you're within your 7 days, you should have a cache location at the same time that you can reference, and then you can see that delta.
Mhm.
What are your thoughts on dealing with, now I'm past my 7 days? Did you notice I built this up in this order intentionally? Now I'm past my 7 days. I don't have that information, but I've got some third party app data that gives me geolocation reference information. How do you feel about using that data?
I mean, I think it comes down to what else is on the device and what it looks like. Like when you load that extraction into a visualization tool,
Mm-hmm.
when you load it in ours and you start scrubbing through it, you can see which sources which artifacts are showing on that screen at the same time. And then you can get a real quick feel for.
Yeah, but I'm saying it's it because you're already past your 7 days. So you may have an app that, and a weather app is a really, really fair thing, right? So I may have the weather app, and let's say it says I'm in Arlington, Virginia, okay?
Mhm.
And it's saying that I'm in Arlington, Virginia, but you don't know if I'm in Roslyn or am I down by, by the mall or something, right?
Yeah.
Near Pentagon, let's say by Pentagon City. So you don't know if I'm in Pentagon City and those are, well, those are very, very far apart in the minds of traffic in Arlington, Virginia, if anybody's ever driven in DC Metro. But the distance between Roslyn and Pentagon City is going to have the same weather alerts. So is it fair to use that? How do I put that on a map? Are you able to, do I then assign just a larger range when I've got a third party app? Not what does your tool, but what would be perfection in trying to demonstrate that?
Yeah, I think you have to show the radius. I mean, these data points have a radius on them. You have to show that. I mean, at the end of the day, if all of the data that you have isn't precise enough
Right.
to give an accurate answer for your investigation, then you need more data. I mean, there's no two ways about it. You can't just show an inaccurate data point and say they were there. That's just
No,
not
you
how it
can't.
works.
You can't. And the problem is that can be off by more. Again, it's not going to be some far off distant place. You're not going to be in Panama, right? I will
Right.
disclose that weather apps, this is when you have a flag for current location. I can look up the weather in any place. If I wanted to right now, I could pretend I was in Panama and look up the weather there. It's probably nicer than where I live. But yeah, but providing you at a current location flag, it doesn't, just because something says it's the current location doesn't mean it's really the current location
Right.
is the crux.
And you're typically like, I mean, this all depends on a lot of different factors, as we know, but you're going to have sometimes more location data than just that one point from the weather app. And so if you corroborate multiple artifacts from multiple different apps, that's where you're going to be able to potentially, as Thrasher said, have more evidence.
I'll even add, geolocation, obviously, geolocation data is like top tier, evidence, but it is up to, it's not the only part of an investigation. So corroborating many, many other things, while it could be great to be able to show a path, if we don't have enough geolocation data to do that, it is incumbent upon the investigators to do their investigative work, to interview witnesses and look for other data. And so, it's a great tool, but if there's not enough, then we have to do more work.
So Debbie,
Anyway.
I love your point here, and I'm going to throw my next question to you.
Great.
She's like, oh great, now I get a question.
Yeah.
So like I said, I've been doing a lot of Daubert and Fry hearings on geolocation evidence recently, right? So Jobber and Fry hearings, it depends what state you're on in the US, which standard you are. But at the end of the day, they're challenging a specific artifact in the Daubert and Fry. It's not getting compared to that corroborative element and
Mhm.
then getting thrown out. What are your thoughts on that? Because that's kind of where I have the problem. I'm like, yeah, but my artifact isn't in isolation. My artifact does match up to the surveillance footage, and my artifact does, but they're getting thrown out because of, yeah. Anyway, I'd love to hear
I'm
your
not,
thoughts.
obviously, I'm not a prosecutor,
Well,
but
I'd love to hear your thoughts as how I handle that on the stand.
you
Like,
know, so I mean, ultimately, it is simply being, you would go through that exercise, the Daubert or the Fry hearing. They may throw out your artifact. The jury will hear other evidence. They will hear, other evidence related to
I'm
the
asking,
location of various things that occurred in the commission of a crime.
what do
So,
I, as the examiner, do during that Daubert or Fry hearing when I'm being asked about, that, but this artifact exists in isolation? Is there a way for me to infer that it doesn't exist in isolation? Do I say that no artifact should be taken in isolation and it should always be looked at in corroboration with other
yes,
artifacts? What is
yes.
your thought on
I
that? Like,
think,
what do
I
I
think
say as the examiner?
again, not a prosecutor, but I
No.
am always going to, tell, that goes without saying, tell the truth, have like all of the information. I think it does not, nothing in a crime exists singularly.
Yep.
No piece of evidence exists singularly. So yes, I do believe an examiner should say that, this particular artifact also correlates to, other evidence that was in the case. I think that that's a reasonable thing to say.
Right. Right. That an artifact has more value in corroboration with other existing artifacts, right?
Yeah, I
So,
know that they're talking about a singular artifact
mhm.
possibly,
Mhm.
but it doesn't exist in the universe in a singular manner. There are other facts that go with that artifact.
And I will mention again, right, that this is why, if you're doing research, to anyone listening, please, please, please submit it for peer review. The peer review of your research is what helps things meet that generally reliable and acceptable in the profession standard, which exists in both. And peer review will help those artifacts get accepted in court, because a lot of times what's happening is, especially if it's something you just discovered or that you've been working on and you can't find other written documentation on, peer review is what'll help it get past that Daubert Fry standard. So peer review your work. Send it off. DFIR review. Look it up. um, that allows you to peer review a blog that you've already have public. All right. So now you've been doing this for quite some time, visualizing geolocation data. What's the biggest hurdle in visualizing geolocation data?
Oh man, I think one of the big things that we've come across is like parsing timestamps. As simple as that sounds, you wouldn't believe how many hundreds, thousands of different ways timestamps can be represented. Like I bet, if you go out and ask 100 people to write this timestamp down, how they would prefer to see it, everyone's gonna either write the date first or the, 2 digits for hour, minutes. Like there's just so many different formats for timestamps. I think that's definitely been a challenge that I've seen just from like the outside perspective, but I'm sure Thrasher has a lot more detail on all the challenges since he's doing the heavy lifting.
Yeah, I think timestamps, it's always hard. And, like we say our preference is UTC or at least a timestamp that has a marked time zone, or picking some really consistent, well-known standard is going to be the best. But we do make a best effort to parse anything that you give to us for a timestamp. But yeah, I think mapping the data, I would say, the biggest technical challenges really just come down to location data is either very sparse or incredibly voluminous. It's rarely in between, right? You either have tons of data or very little data. And presenting that is technically is incredibly hard to do it in a way that where you can have a play like slider that you can just drag and you see things change right before your eyes without having to wait on a loading animation or without it being jerky. Yeah, so I think in general it's just there's a lot of small challenges that come with presenting location evidence well.
So we've been speaking about a lot of these like point geolocation artifacts that have this space-time connection, but there are artifacts that aren't point-based, right? We've got data from cell towers, we've got geofencing, we've got just proximity artifacts like Bluetooth connections and Wi-Fi connections. How do we articulate that in the same landscape as these much more powerful point in time locations?
I think a lot of this comes down to just how the big analysis tools are going to allow you to rip that information out and then present it. Like, I mean, how would you go about displaying, or would you basically put those on the same map today, Jessica? Or how would you
You
go?
flipped it back to me. That's not fair. No. So for me, I would use some different geographic, geometric shape to represent that difference, right? So if I'm doing all these point locations and circles based on their radius, but I have something like I have cell tower, obviously you're going to do like a cone of radius, but if I have something like a Wi-Fi or a Bluetooth, I might use a geometric box to differentiate that, and maybe I would change the shading. So things that are less reliable would be more transparent. Yeah, and things that are more definitive would be more solid. And then you can kind of see the integration of those zones. And when you're talking about playing something, right, like somebody may go into a school building. Schools are notorious for not having cell reception. They have those big, evil bricks, heavy concrete buildings, but you've got geolocation going up to it. Then you've got a Wi Fi connection in the school. So now you've got like this big box around the school that shows, you know, that this is a Wi-Fi connection, not a point connection. And then we pick up again when we see the time later come out. And I think that that visually gives the person who I'm demonstrating to the difference between, you know, this artifact is a proximity based artifact, so it's being represented by this square. And maybe I'm doing a geofence, so I'm using a dashed line around the geofence area to show that something's coming in or out of a significant location vicinity, for example, and then picking up on more particular. So that's kind of my thought, is using variance in shading and lining along with variance in geometric shape to demonstrate the definitiveness and granularity, as well as the precision by the size of circles of what's happening. And I feel like those are things that as we play them, to be honest, it's the way I'd articulate something to someone who doesn't speak the same language as me. And sometimes that's the best way to think about how do we do something visual.
Yeah, basically, like you can't just represent all location data as a dot on a map.
Yes, this is what I'm saying. And I have made that mistake. That's how I know this, because I've made the circles on the maps before and had it be confusing to, it made sense to me because I knew the data. But then when I was explaining it to others, regardless of the environment, it is not as clear. So using differentiation of shape and shading allows you to show the both the accuracy and definitiveness, as well as the transfer from, you know, you're in a vehicle with like a burla ivy extraction, boop, 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 boop. And then they get out and they're on their phone and it's like boop, 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 boop. And then they go into that schoolhouse and it's like blah. Right? You want to see that differentiation. And when you're playing it in time, it starts to make sense.
Right. Yeah. And it's really important to, like you mentioned, just different shading for each kind of confidence. Like you can use different ways of displaying that, but
Sure.
like
You
said,
asked me.
Yeah, there's someone who, if you're trying to articulate different granularities, accuracies of data, things need to be different colors, different opacities, different shapes. And you really need to think about, okay, if I'm looking at this at a glance, how am I going to interpret this as far as like a geolocation data set.
I'm also very
Furthermore,
cognizant not to use colors, and that's because it sounds silly, but well, it's not silly. It's actually really important, but it's because I've learned the importance of I have a colleague who's colorblind, and I've learned so much about representation of data through that exercise of it not being distinguishable for all people, and we have to keep that in mind.
you have to pick specific color palettes for sure. I'd say, it takes it even further. You talk about discrete location points. Well, your location data may stop at the entrance to the school, and then your, accuracy may become giant circles. But you probably have surveillance footage inside of that building. And then you can click on the building on the map where they were in the building. This is where they were because I saw them with the camera at this
Right.
timestamp.
Well, and that's a good point. You might have that big square, right, for that moment, but then you appear in this very specific point. So now you can go, well, there was a travel of direction, right? So now you can use like arrows to indicate travel direction. You're asking again me, not the way you brilliant people do it on a computer, right? I might put arrows to indicate travel direction, or some kind of like waveform or something to point like it's going in this, and at this time now I'm there. So somehow I got from this location outside the building, I went into the building, I now became connected to that Wi-Fi, I'm just in that Wi-Fi matrix, which is the whole building, but then I'm here within a couple of seconds. So I didn't go over here, right? I stayed somewhere in this track. Even if I did this to get there, I didn't get all the way up here.
Yeah, I think that's like, we learned this because we came from purely digital forensics background, right? Like working on analysis tools, like processing the raw databases. And then now we're in a land that's just a little bit more abstract, a little bit more, less forensic-y, more
I apologize. We never had you introduce yourselves or say where you were from or your background. And I think that's just because Debbie and I both know you so well. We just started talking. Oops. So if you want to divulge a little bit right there.
Let's do it.
There we go. There's the late intro. But
which he just didn't say.
To Debbie.
So Alec and Thrasher both were developers at Gray Key / Magnet before embarking on this geolocation thing.
Yeah, they were at Gray Shift and then moved to Magnet, and that's where I met them.
Before my Magnet time, for clarity.
Yeah, and that's where we learned about just how much of this data is out there, how complex it gets, and now we're trying to build something that basically takes all that complexity and simplifies it down so that the jury can understand it, so that DA can understand it, and all these types of things. And one thing that we learned real fast, because we started with purely forensic artifacts like location data, is Debbie's point, which is like a lot of this evidence for real world cases is the forensics data sits in the background. It's incredibly important, right? Like it's a layer that exists on the map as part of the story, but it is in the background, and in the foreground you have that surveillance footage. You have additional artifacts off the phone. Maybe they sent a text message, or there's a photo from the camera roll that happened at a particular time. But the actual points on the map, or any of the geometric shapes that we're putting on there, kind of sit in the background of the rest of that story that you've created as the investigator.
I'm going to ask one final question. You ready?
Yep.
This is the landmine question. So you mentioned, that you're working on making these visualizations and these representations easy for folks who maybe don't have the technical depth of a forensics examiner to be able to understand, right? You're detailing the story to the judge, the jury, the DA. Well, with a tool like yours, why do we need a digital forensics examiner?
Yeah, why don't we just show all the data and not have any testimony to accuracy or anything like that?
Yeah, explain to me why do we, if I could just drop all the geolocations in your tool, why do I need an examiner? I am definitely playing devil's advocate here.
Totally. I mean, it's kind of the same argument as people say, like, oh, well, now that we have AI, do we need examiners? And I think any examiner just scoffs at that, right? Because they're like, okay, there's more to it than what you can get. There's these things technology makes errors, whether it's AI, deterministic technology. Complexity requires human interpretation. That's the definition of an expert, right? Like being able to analyze a complex data set and convert it into more human relatable concepts. And
But
so
Lumix makes geolocation data human related. What relatable? Why do I need an expert?
You still need to know how to, if someone needs to know when to show what or to not show. Lumix allows you to visualize everything, but some of that data has a good reason to be excluded or to be talked about specifically. And the only person who knows that criteria is the forensic expert.
I mean, also, you need someone to extract the data. You need someone to,
right. Obviously, that all of
like
that
there are other steps in the process other than dragging the data into a tool and looking at the visualization.
I am going to say that just as the geolocations need their timestamps for context, the artifact needs its meaning for context. Data that's parsed out of any system is just going to be binary representation of points. But those binary representations of data do not tell you why they got there, how they got there, and what they mean, regardless of what the columns mean. And that's why you need an examiner to still explain the location points. It's the same reason that you need the timestamp.
Right. A good example being, I'll just shout out to Safari browser history entries and their timestamps.
I don't know what you're talking about.
Well, you search, Okay, all right. I was about to say,
I am blatantly joking. Nothing like a browser state DB URL and timestamp to make that point abundantly clear.
That's right.
Yes. Well, thank you, gentlemen, so much for your time and for really explaining the importance of bringing space and time together so that we could get clear understandings of our geolocation evidence.
Thank you very much.
Thanks. Bye.
Bye, you guys.